the biggest things, especially when you use the same name in Call of Duty, is that it's the same game every single year. We saw this with MW2 to MW3, and now we're going to MW4. Even though if you actually look at the franchise as a whole over the 20 plus years, you have World War II games, you have Vietnam, you have futuristic games. I think one of the biggest problems, they still, when they dive into these specific categories, still adhering to like what makes COD COD. Because if you're just making a generic first person shooter, there's a lot of things that you can do. And you know, maybe you steal some elements from Battlefield or CS or Rainbow Six Siege, and there's a lot of those, but these games have their specific identity. When they make changes, do they actually matter and they're impactful to the player while still fitting under the umbrella of what makes COD COD? So ideally what I want to talk about is kind of what that framework looks like and what I'm looking for in a Call of Duty, and where does MW4 fit in this mix, and where MW2 kind of went wrong in this area. Because I think every successful franchise is the best when it really sticks to its core values of what their like North Star is when they're developing their game. It's not just about graphics or specific mechanics. It's like the design philosophy on the way those things interact with each other. Just like Halo came out with their Combat Evolved thing, where it's like a remaster. I played it myself. I got a chance to play it early. And one thing that I saw with a lot of the feedback after the fact is, and I'll agree with, is it felt really weird to play it with the sprint. They added a sprint mechanic to the original Halo, which wasn't there. And the game just plays completely different. The pacing, it gets kind of trivialized how far you can get from point A to point B because of how much you can just move around the space. And it really changes the identity. You know, people could jump to a conclusion and say, well, sprint is bad then. No. It's case by case. In Halo's identity, it doesn't really need the sprint. If we remove the sprint from Call of Duty, yeah, that would be a bad thing, I think. I think just walking everywhere would be kind of a little bit of a change of pace. So there's got to be that balance that works for the game's identity, the same way that when Battlefield does their thing, or those other games I listed, Apex does their thing, there's only so many changes you can do to the core like pillars. If to veer too far off would be a problem. And COD has experimented with this, and sometimes it ends up where a specific mechanic will double dip into other categories. So in the classic CODs, we did have limited sprint, and then they would solve it with a perk. But they probably saw that the pick rate was so high that they ended up converting it over to unlimited sprint. So it doesn't end up feeling like you have to have a specific crutch perk. Same thing with like stopping power and some other things that happen in the game. They change mechanics so that they can make it where it's going to be, okay, these aren't crutch perks that you have to use in order to enjoy the game, because having crutch perks actually takes away from another pillar, which was maybe like autonomy of the player or something like that. So we'll kind of go through that. There's ways that you could change the mechanics, but you still have to visualize like, how does this fit into the core areas? And I think for Call of Duty, they generally going to have 5 pillars, which, let's say the first one is fast and responsive gameplay. So this is how the sprint will work, the ADS, which we saw this in MW2, the jump and slowdown, which I believe is removed in MW4. Maybe it's significantly reduced, if not removed. Way the handling works, weapon animation, you know, whether you get locked into animation. So those kind of like where it feels fast and responsive. MW2, when they added the mantle hang, it was a kind of a cool feature because it gave you a little bit more autonomy and creativity with the map, but it felt like you could be locked into that animation. When you slide, you couldn't fire your weapon, you couldn't cancel the animation. When you did your streaks, they were very slow to come out and very slow to go back in, versus in some of the older CODs, you could even cancel that animation of the UAV phone coming out where you go, a UAV inbound, and you would just go, whoop, cancel it, and it would automatically cancel the animation. So an older game actually feels way more responsive than the newer game, and that's where I think, you know, you kind of veer too far out of that pillar. Readability. I think it should be very easy to be predictable where players are moving to, what the visuals look like, the clarity, the outlines. Cold War struggled with this a little bit because things blended in and meshed together. And then obviously with MW2, we had the big visual noise with the smoke, the visual shake, despite recoils not being insane or anything. The visibility just in general and clarity, if there's too much clutter. They messed up some stuff when they swapped over, I believe in MW2 as well. They pushed forced anti-aliasing, which led to a lot of blurring and mesh issues where it just helped, you know, hurt the clarity. Audio, typically in most CODs, it goes back to kind of what I was talking about with the crutch perk of the unlimited sprint. Then you also have the crutch perk with the dead silence, where if the footsteps are too loud, now you're kind of forcing your players to use dead silence, versus if it's a little bit more manageable and they find that sweet spot, which I agree is sometimes difficult to do, because then if they're so silent, then it's like what feels like everyone's playing with dead silence or ninja. And then if it's too loud, then well, now you get people pre-aiming, especially when you can't just slide into a corner or jump out and, you know, fire your weapon. There's limitations put on the player, and it shifts the combat too far away from that fast and responsive gameplay. I think the HUD can get into it as well, like being able to clearly see, okay, what your health looks like, what your ammo situation is. There's only so many iterations they can do on this. Obviously, it's like, oh, new game, they got to do something different. But it's like at the same time, maybe they just change the text. I don't know. I think the HUD could be clear, readable. Sometimes it gets a little bit oversaturated, especially in multiplayer. There's not really a need for the compass when you have the mini map. But obviously the compass got added because of Warzone. And then also in 2019, they were planning to start the game without a mini map. So the plan was to always just have the compass as your navigation tool without a mini map, which that again leads to some readability issues and predictability. There's also the game flow part of it, where COD has a specific pace. They've talked about this a lot in Warzone, where it's time to action or something like that, where basically how long it takes for the player to get into a gunfight. And this is changed quite a bit with the way the spawns work. In 2019, they used a system that a lot of people end up referring to squad spawns, which are not inherently the correct way to have spawns in Call of Duty. They changed the formula. Cold War got it right. Vanguard ended up improving it over the year because they had to rework what MW 2019 gave them with the engine. And MW2 was still trash when it came to the squad spawns. And then it eventually has been improved over the years. And I don't believe MW4 is going to have the squad spawn. So there's a specific flow that happens with that. And it's not just in the gameplay, it's outside of the game, where in the menus, how easy is it to get to? The Hulu menu nonsense that people joked about, where they paid some guy probably $1 billion to create a menu that everyone hated. I don't know how they did that. It wasn't $1 billion, but, you know, hyperbole. And it's just like, how much friction can you remove from the game? And I think they've done things where I've noticed it when I went back and played the BO2 and BO1 ports. One of the best quality of lives in terms of the game flow is like being able to adjust your creative class when you load into the match, especially when you unlock a new attachment or a new gun. You can just do it right off the fly. And versus like back then you couldn't. So it's like, ooh, there's a little bit of friction there. So I think that's like a change that happened over the years, where it's like, well, it feels like I'm missing something if I go back. It's just such a great quality of life. And then just the overall pacing. This is one thing that if you look at MW2 and MW 2019, if you play full Dom match, normally the top fragger in the lobby usually going to get like 50, 60 kills. In normal Call of Duties, if you go a lot of them, depending on the pacing and, you know, whatever, that'd be like a top frag good score. But there was people in like the teens in MW 2019 and MW2, which the pacing was drastically changed from the squad spawn system, some of the other load-in camera delay, and some issues there. So I think there's that. But then you also got to have the player expression. I think that's another pillar where you have some autonomy in that, where that's the creative class. And that goes back to the dead silence thing I talked about, where you remove that if you make it a crutch perk, or other perks along the line. And I think that's sometimes what happens when you force people to have a tactical and a lethal. People are throwing nades right off spawn because they get it for free. They just equip it. Everyone has one. So now you're kind of into a crutch situation where you got to use a flak jacket or equivalent, or attack mask equivalent. And now you're kind of like, oh, well, I'm forced to use this. You remove the player expression So sometimes limiting options like we've seen with the pick 10, which I think is overall a superior system if optimized for the modern game, that would be like the perfect system for me. I think you can end up a scenario where you are building the game to function correctly and give the players that expression. But there's also expression in, the created class. How much autonomy do you have to be able to modify the class? Although the pick 10 was heavily restrictive on how many attachments you needed, most guns felt good right out the box versus now, like I covered in my previous video where I said the new guns, when you get them, they feel like they're the broken version of the gun, like unwell, and then you kind of have to rebuild it to full health, right? Like it just kind of is a crappy feeling when you're progressing. There's different movement expression. Obviously, in some of the more movement shooter type examples where you got wall jumping, wall bouncing, jetpacking, sliding, diving, and other mechanics related to that, whether it's snaking. There's different skills that have been used over the years that aren't all like just movement, like in terms of slide, but there are ways to express the player like that, damn, this guy is actually pretty good, even in BO2. Or even in BO1 or MW2, the old one, or MW3, the old one, or Ghost, or whatever, any of these older CODs, you still had movement expression, even if the movement was more limited and confined to that time period before we had unlimited sprint and these other options. And you got that freedom to truly have different play styles. And this is one thing that we joked a lot about with MW2, where we joked that it was built for Sentinel players, which is the terminology they used, and the game really felt like it was much more of a slow pace where you are punished for moving, which of course there's like a needle you got to kind of thread, and maybe forcing the pace to be intentional was good in some ways, but it negatively impacted other parts of these pillars that I'm talking about, just like this, where you maybe not feel like you can be a running gunner, you can't be a flanker or a stealth player. You feel like you can be the support player. There's different like autonomy other than just camper or whatever the case is, that it often felt like that game they kind of resorted to, because if you did a slide, you're stuck in that animation, and you know that if you see somebody sliding in MW2, that's a free kill. Basically, they can't hit fire you. It's a free kill. And then I think that kind of last pillar that everything fits into is kind of like how they reward the player for playing and the overall progression. So that could be XP, weapon leveling, challenges, mastery stuff, camos, calling cards, and then unlocks. And I think there's a right way to do this and a wrong, and I think we veered towards the wrong way. And I think even in MW4, even though they have this gunning system that can make it easier and more streamlined for the novice or casual to jump on, they can create a class in seconds. I think it still veered too far away from the simplicity of the golden era of COD with you get a gun, maybe you get one or two attachments. Of course, I think people have been accustomed to the gunsmith where maybe you get 5 on a gun, but I think there's got to be a balance where it actually feels like the base version of the gun is like really good or good, solid, and then you build on top of that to make it good instead of making it whole. This is a point I made like in a full video. Like I said, I've referenced already, but it's kind of one of those things that you want to be able to have the player load up and go, that's the gun I want. Boom, I use the gun. It feels great off the rip. And if I upgrade it, it feels slightly better. And that's fine. Even if attachments have less value or less meaning, that's fine. As long as the base version is good, I think that helps. And it goes back to, do you feel like you're being punished? Which I think that's what's happened with the leveling system. Because if the gun was great out of the box and attachments just made it slightly better, they could have 150 levels on a gun. Who gives a damn? Like, the base version's great. But because it's not that, and we know that they unlock the biggest mag at level 62, it's like, yeah, F me until I get all the way there. 6 hours later without double XP, it's going to be, that's how you can balance it out. So I think those would be the core pillars. I think there's some other layers to it, which we'll talk about as well. Again, fast and responsive gameplay, readability, gameplay flow, player expression, and then how the reward and progression works within the game. And I think if you look at how MW2 handled these things versus even BO3 or World at War, you'll see that the things that like resonated with players fell pretty much within these kind of pillars. And that's how a game like World at War could feel 100% like a COD. And then you could jump on BO3 and it still feel 100% like a COD, because they really adhered to these pillars. And then outside of that, the devs have full of creative freedom to change the theme, the art style. And that's one thing that a lot of people get caught up on, is the graphics. They kind of blend those in with the art style, even though they are significantly different, and you get the freedom within the framework. So all of those pillars, I think, fit into that first layer, which is like, what is COD trying to be? What does it mean to be a COD game? Like that North Star that they're really developing the game around. And everything should be at the core focus of trying to hit all of those pillars. And if it's going against the grain or it's causing too much friction in any of those, then it's probably not a good decision. And if you had to have another layer, it'd be like supporting systems that will allow for all of those things to flourish. The player ecosystem, what does that look like? What is the experience? And some of those are out of the devs' hands. Like if you're playing on a Wi-Fi hotspot in like 100 meters away from your router or whatever the hell, you're going to have a terrible connection and you're going to have issues with the game, versus somebody that's direct wired, 10 gig up, 10 gig down, fiber. It's going to be a little bit of a different experience. One thing I want to point out, if you are enjoying like the videos just discussing COD and news in general, feel free to like and subscribe if you want to be able to find your way back for more of that content. One thing that COD runs into is a 3-year development cycle, meaning that Treyarch is finishing up their current game, but they're already going to start working on their next game, which, let's say hypothetically it's BO8. Hopefully it's not, but let's say it's BO8. And Sledgehammer's already been working on their game for 3 years. And IW, as soon as this one comes out, they're going to already be working on their game. So a lot of times the feedback loop doesn't even get implemented into the game. The feedback that we got in Modern Warfare 2 has made it into MW4 because they got it, and now they were able to inject it into their game from the get-go, versus like MW3 really didn't get that. There were obviously some things they were able to switch right off the bat. BO6 and 7 also had their thing where they were able to get some stuff together. But realistically, if there's a big like core change that they need to make because the theme was bad or something, it's too late. It's going to take 2 to 3 years to divert that course and get back on track. And that's kind of what we saw, where they had negative feedback about jetpacks and advanced warfare, but BO3 was already in the works. IW was already in the works. So by the time they had the feedback rolling, that's why we got World War II. Most grounded, like from 2140 or whatever the hell the futuristic CODs were on, 2400 or whatever the hell, super futuristic, jetpacks, exoskeletons, to boots on the ground World War II. So that's kind of where that feedback loop comes in. So when they make the game, like they can get a little bit outside the box if they don't rein it in, but also the pillars should be used as like a system there where they're like, okay, this still fits within that. We should be fine to be able to deliver. And then they have the option where they can go too safe, which then people just say, it's the same game. And then if they go too different, people be like, it doesn't even feel like COD anymore. What were they thinking? So the community over the years has kind of narrowed that gap to make that sweet spot that much smaller and very difficult to achieve. And COD didn't do any favors. MW2 to MW3, stupid naming scheme to do a back-to-back with the same franchise, even though they were made by different studios. And then Treyarch doing the same thing from 6 to 7. I hate to have to say that each time with this. But yes, 6 to 7. They did the same thing, and it doesn't land well. It's like bad. If we apply the thinking of the pillar system to MW2, there's 2 versions of the game. There's one is if the game didn't have the name Call of Duty on it, how good of a game would have MW2 been? I think overall, pretty good. Probably like a solid 8 or 9 out of 10 multiplayer experience. But when it gets graded versus Call of Duty, what we expect from a Call of Duty, how it fits within the franchise, the identity of Call of Duty, it fails miserably on several counts. You could argue maybe some things fit within those pillars and certain things, but so many things were at the detriment of the gameplay loop that we expect from Call of Duty that it was received poorly overall. And it's also one of those things that have the biggest fall off in player retention. We saw when that game came out, sold over 30 million. The hype train was insane. They had good faith in the community, still pretty positive. And then in the second that basically dropped, we saw it at COD Next. Everyone was like, ooh, I don't know about this. And then kind of went down, and the player fall off never recovered for COD. And there has been a big cloud of toxicity around COD since that issue, because they veered so far off. If this was made by XYZ developer, not attached to COD, people would have been like, cool game, because they don't have the expectations of how it fits into Call of Duty and what it makes to make a COD game work. Now that brings us to MW4, because I personally think it does look different. Having played it, we've seen some of the different gameplay elements they've shown. I think it looks drastically different than MW2. I think it is a graphical jump. Dropping old gen definitely helps with that. And hopefully that helps with some of the anti-aliasing issues where it did make some things muddy, blurry, artifacting. So it works. And from playing it and all the different details we know about MW4, it feels like they adhered better to some of the pillars that I'm talking about that worked in MW2, the old one, World at War, and BO3 that still make a good COD. Even though there's certain elements that I'm not 100% on board with. Does that mean I think it's a perfect game? No. But I think COD changes organically, naturally. They do have to evolve and adapt. But as long as they're adhering to what makes COD COD, I think that's the challenge for the franchise. But that's also what I think elevates the game when it does hit those marks. And I think at times it struggled. And that's where it's been really bad for the community. So we got about 3 weeks until the MW4 beta. You guys will get a chance to get your hands on it yourself. I'm going to be doing the COD Next stream, so if you want to go ahead and check that out, follow over on Twitch. That's where I'll be live. Maybe on YouTube here as well. I haven't decided. And we'll see kind of what really matters and how it actually impacts it, because I think that gunfight demonstration wasn't really good enough. You have to let me know what your guys' thoughts are in the comments. See you on the next one. Thank you for watching as always. Have a great day.